Hey dudes, today I have something a little different for you. Today I'm going to talk about 10 older removal cards that you may not have heard of that are potentially really good in Commander. So, without further ado, let's get to it. We'll start with white cards, and our first one is Illumination. Illumination costs 2 white mana, and it counters an artifact or an enchantment spell. The caster gains life equal to the casting cost, but that doesn't really matter. The real joy of this card is your opponent's face when you counter something while having 2 white mana up. This card probably can't hang in CEDH, but in any other level of play or group that doesn't cry the second you play a removal spell, this card is awesome. It's certainly narrow, but it also flies under the radar. This particular card showed up in Mirage, and nowhere else. But despite only having one printing, it's less than 50 cents. Our second white card is also not the best thing that you can be doing, but it is funny. Martyr's Cry also costs 2 white mana, but this one is a sorcery. Martyr's Cry has the following effect. Exile all white creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller draws a card. Wow, and people used to complain that there was no card draw in white. This card is a fun puzzle piece, but it also functions well in removal-sensitive pods, because while it may take creatures, it replaces them with a card. It can also function as card advantage. Sort of. If you have a way to make a bunch of white creature tokens, you could use this for card advantage. Otherwise, it's not really drawing you any cards, it's just replacing the cards it exiles. It's not an efficient piece that works all the time, but if you build around it right and use it creatively, then it's a fantastic piece that might liven up your game night. Martyr's Cry is from the dark, and it's never been reprinted, and probably never will, since this bad boy is on the reserved list. With that context, it's actually pretty cheap, sitting around $6 to $10 on most sites. But let's move on to the blue cards, shall we? The first one I want to talk about is called Hurkyls Recall. This is a pretty powerful card that's admittedly a little narrow. For 1 in a blue, you can return all artifacts target player owns to their hand. This only hurts artifact decks, obviously, but I'd argue those are pretty common. And it also blows up all of a player's treasures. Because treasures can't go to the hand, so if they get bounced, it's the same as destroying them. Treasures are another thing that seem to be really common, and can be heavily represented even in decks that don't normally care about artifacts. This card was originally in Antiquities, and is more common than the 2 white cards I've talked about, having multiple reprintings, and you can usually find one for around $2 to $3. Hurkyls Recall is a fairly popular card though, but have you heard of Political Trickery? For 2 and a blue, you can exchange control of target land you control and target land an opponent controls, and this effect lasts indefinitely. So, if your opponent has one of those lands you don't want to deal with, you can make them deal with it by simply taking it. First printed in Mirage, and only reprinted in a World Championship deck, this card is still fairly cheap at around $5. If you're tired of playing into Field of the Dead, or God forbid a Gaia's Cradle, this might be a worthwhile include. So, let's talk about the black spells. The first one I want to talk about is from Homelands, a very famous set for having cards in it. Dry Spell is a meta call, I'd say, but it's a fairly efficient burn spell that deals 1 damage to every creature and every player for only 1 in a black mana. There are more efficient versions of this in red, but if you're not in red and are having trouble dealing with a bunch of 1/1s or someone making a mass amount of small creature tokens, this might be worth consideration. It can also synergize with Blood Artist effects, if people decide to deal with your sack outlets. It's very cheap as far as board wipes go, but obviously it doesn't hit most things. And when I say cheap, I mean in price too. You can pick one of these up for like 35 cents. But next up is a card you've probably seen if you play at the highest levels, because this card is actually efficient enough and does something impactful enough to see play in CEDH. Withering Boon is a black instant that costs 1 and a black. As an additional cost, you must pay 3 life. but this counters a creature spell in black for 2 mana. When this card was released, creatures weren't that great, and as a result, this card wasn't that great. It's still not super great if you're playing in blue, but if you're playing Commander and blue isn't part of your color identity, then Withering Boon is a really solid option, especially as creatures continue to be pushed and are far more impactful. Withering Boon is from Mirage and hasn't been reprinted. You can pick up a Withering Boon for between $5 to $10 on most sites, which isn't cheap, but it certainly isn't expensive by most metrics either. Moving right along to the red spells, the first one I want to talk about is Burnout. Burnout is a narrow counter spell in red. For 1 in a red mana, Burnout will counter target instant spell if it's blue. On top of that, Burnout replaces itself at the beginning of the next upkeep. If you're annoyed with a blue mage for countering your win condition, or even just some random spell you really want to resolve, Burnout might provide some utility to you. Obviously, this card doesn't do much if nobody is playing blue, but it'll still replace itself even if you target a non-blue spell with it. So it's never completely dead. It doesn't feel good paying 2 mana for a draw, but at the very least it'll do something. It's a fairly cheap card, originally appearing in alliances, and it'll cost you about $1. The next red card I want to talk about was recently reprinted in Modern Masters 3. Originally from Urza's Saga, Meltdown is an aggressively efficient card that works great at high levels of play. With a casting cost of X and a red, Meltdown will destroy each artifact with a mana value of X or less. To start with, that's just a very efficient artifact board wipe. But in case you didn't know, you can pay 0 for X and just pay a single red mana to blow up every artifact with a mana value of 0. This includes stuff like Mox Diamond or Chrome Mox, but it also includes tokens, like Treasure or Artifact Creature tokens. This is another relatively narrow piece, but I don't know if I've ever played a game of Commander where this didn't have at least a couple of targets. Because of its recent reprinting, you can pick up a copy of this hyper-efficient and potentially devastating card for less than $1. Unless your meta has 0 artifacts in it, this is at least worth consideration. But let's talk about the green cards now. To start with, let's talk about Superior Numbers. This is a very green card, and like everything else on this list, it's fairly narrow, but if you're building a green deck that has a lot of creatures to cast, this might be worth considering. Superior Numbers costs 2 green mana, and it deals damage to target creature equal to the number of creatures you control in excess of the number of creatures target opponent controls. That's a mouthful, but basically, if your opponent has 3 creatures and you have 7, this will deal 4 damage to one of their creatures because you have 4 more creatures. Green kind of struggles to deal with creatures, with any method that doesn't involve the fight mechanic. But if you're playing small green creatures, fight cards struggle to get anything done. This is a wonderful alternative to that if your deck can accommodate it. Superior Numbers was originally released in Mirage, and despite never being reprinted, you can still pick one up for less than 50 cents. And the last card we're talking about today is actually a 2-for-1. These cards are basically the same card, so I figured I'd talk about them both. Serene Heart and Tranquil Domain are both from Mirage, and they both cost 1 and a green mana. They both have 0 reprints, but are still available for less than $1. Serene Heart destroys all auras in play for just 2 mana, and Tranquil Domain destroys all non-aura enchantments in play for just 2 mana. If you find yourself against an enchantment deck, both of these provide a lot of value for a relatively low mana investment. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. If this is your first time watching my channel, I don't normally do Commander content, and that isn't likely to change in the near future, but if you're interested in Magic history, you might find something worthwhile in my catalog of videos. If not, that's okay. I appreciate you stopping by. If you enjoyed this, I'd appreciate a comment or a like, but it's not that big of a deal either way. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a magical day.